Good day, Father. For part one, I chose Augustine's Theology of Grace, and I'll try to discuss how his theology can be made to look, act, feel like Jesus. In short, how to crucify Augustine's Theology of Grace. The second part will be a critique on my reified idea of grace that is not Christic, and how the course reform and renew my understanding of grace from different theologians such as Augustine, Thomas, Ranner, and others. Let me first briefly discuss Augustine's context. He's a moralist. For him to be able to attain or merits God's grace or be favored by God, we need to strip off everything that is lustful, bodily, and material. Remember that this was Augustine's ordeal when he wrote his spiritual experiences in the Confession. For him, humanity will always be struggling between different dichotomies, good and evil, bodily and spiritual, heaven and earth. It is not surprising because Augustine, as we know, followed Gnostics and Manichaeism for 9 years. No wonder his theology of grace is a cacophony of dualist realities. Humanity, according to Augustine, is basically flawed. That was his premise. Therefore, in order to attain a life that is considered graced by God, one has to remove or strip off all that is human to attain spiritual perfection. And how we can attain that? Grace, according to Augustine. There are three important elements in the theology of grace according to Augustine. First, our inevitability of sinning. Second, our bad habits. And lastly, the absolute necessity of grace. Let me discuss first the first element, our inevitability of sinning. This claim, again, is a product of Augustine's Gnostic and Manichaeistic influence regarding human nature. If he thought that body is chained with sinful tendencies, when it supports his claim, then it supports his claim that indeed it is inevitable for us to sin. In the words of St. Paul himself, he says, "My spirit is willing, but my body is weak." Again, the dichotomy of Augustine's theology is very present here. Second, our bad habits. Since humanity is flawed, according to Augustine, it is also inevitable to do what is evil. And when it becomes a habit, it eventually becomes a pattern of bad habits that becomes hard to let go. To let go. Good example is when you allow little child to say or do something bad, and no one is reprimanding him or her to explain why a certain behavior is bad and how it affects other people around him or her. Third and last, the absolute necessity for grace. Quoting chapter 16, Treatise on Grace and Free Will, from the word of St. Paul to the Corinthians, "Not that we are sufficient of ourselves to think anything as of ourselves, but our sufficiency is of God." Here, end of quote. Here, it tells us that no matter how gifted and talented we may be, we are always in absolute necessity for grace. We are like empty pots without grace, and we cannot give something good if we are not graced by God. So how does grace act in Augustine's theology? How are we going to crucify his theology of grace? First, as prevenient, operative. From Stephen Duffy's book on the dynamics of grace, on page 97, last paragraph, and I quote, "Thus, grace in Augustine's theology does not merely teach us what must be done, it enables us to do it." End of quote. God acts before person begins to desire. Nauuna palagi ang Diyos. This characteristic of grace is very Christic, seen in most of his acts when Jesus starts doing his public ministry. Example, when he approached the blind man, Bartimaeus, and asked him, "What do you want me to do to you?" I want to see," says the blind man. But before, grace acts despite Bartimaeus' blindness. He sought for Jesus. Christ, God, grace, acts before He desires to see. Laging nauuna ang Diyos. Second, grace as cooperating. God provides our will with the ability to act on the good. Duffy, in his book The Dynamic of Grace, tells us about Augustine's gratia operans and gratia cooperans. And I quote, "The former initiates charity, which empowers the will to order its love and do good. The latter works with the transformed will to move into action." End of quote. From here, we see how grace is cooperating with us by providing our will to be empowered and transformed to choose to act on the good. For example, I heard this true-to-life story of a boy almost burned to death by his father, and after the boy healed, he chose to forgive his father. God provides the boy's will to act on the good. Amazing, right? It is possible because God cooperates with our will, choosing to act on the good. When Jesus defended the adulterous woman to be stoned to death, He told the crowd, "Let the first one who have not sinned cast stone on her." Right there and then, grace acted on them to realize their own sinfulness and chose not to stone the woman. Grace cooperates. Christ provides their will to act on the good. Third, grace as efficient, enabling us to do good acts. Again, quoting Duffy on Augustine's Theology of Grace, he says, and I quote, "Grace in Augustine's theology does not merely teach us what good things must be done, it enables us to do it." End of quote. God's grace for Augustine does not remain in our head. It penetrates our being to choose to do what is good. This is Christifying effect in following Christ. He enables us to do what is good because He exemplifies what is good. He created an environment where everyone is accepted and loved by God, Gentiles or Jews, woman or man. Last, grace as sanctifying, infuse into us and make us righteous again in God's eyes. Quoting Roger Haidt in his book The Experience and Language of Grace, he says similarly about grace in The Experience of William James, The Empirical Cast of Mind. He says, and I quote, "On conversion, James asked whether or not a sudden conversion is a work of divine intrusion into human personality, whether or not it is miracle of grace. Is such a conversion an actual sanctification?" End of quote. I think it is clear that the miracle of grace sanctifies us, infused us with God's love and grace to be whole again, and to be the person God created us in the beginning, in His likeness. Therefore, it is good. This is the actual experience whenever we receive God's forgiveness in the sacrament of confession. We are sanctified and infused with God's love and mercy. The same Christifying effect when we receive Christ in the Holy Eucharist. Feels like Christ, smells like Christ. In every desire of human heart, grace is there to remind us to choose what is good. Therefore, grace always gives us the opportunity to desire, choose, and act for the good. Just like what the gospel is saying, we are totally dependent on God no matter how we try to subscribe on individualistic style of living. We, the moment we are created, will always be relying on God's goodness. God restores everything from how God created humanity in His divine likeness. Grace brings us back to God, as the famous line of Augustine. We can only find rest in God after our long journey of separating ourselves to God, just like a prodigal son. God will find ways to bring us back to Him. Part 2. I must admit that my idea of grace is something that you earn from doing good, like a prize from a competition or a gift that you expect in return to the goodness you have done. I cannot blame people around me when I was growing up understanding grace the way I do. I bet there are still people out there understand grace the way I used to understand it before. By now I realize that's a wrong notion of grace. From Augustine and Thomas, it is prevenient. God acts before persons even begin to desire to turn back to the good. Laging nauuna ang Diyos na gumawa ng paraan para makabalik tayo sa Kanya. For Luther, I want to say grace is more than sin. Grace can sanctify us, Luther. Believe in the power of grace. And thanks to Ranner for the self-communicating aspect of grace that is relational, incarnational, and personal. The humility of God to humble Himself to meet us where we are. God putting God's self at our disposal. Very human, yet truly divine.